This is Sue Gardner speaking for the Friends of Haythorne House. Today is July 22nd, 2023. Since it's possible there won't be a signal from the Minisink Battlefield Park, I'm recording the speech that I'm giving so that we can have that for those who've asked for it. Today, as we honor the fallen, a part of our understanding of this tragedy is the impact on the men who did make it home, the families of the casualties and their local communities. I think it useful to look at what came after the battle to better understand and look for encouragement and inspiration for our own lives. So my topic is the survivors. For in one way or another, we are all survivors here. It appears from the documents that there were around 100 or more on the American side of the battle who were here or had been nearby and lived. I will tell a few of their stories, drawing from the research of Mark Hendrickson, Deborah Sweeten, and others. Where possible, I will use the words of the eyewitnesses, or as near that generation as can be found. My focus is on what I know best, the men and families of Haythorne's regiment. Battle survivors. Memories of Philip Burrows, grandson of Philip Burrows of Haythorne's regiment, as written in a letter to Lyman Draper in 1879. My grandfather, being a good marksman, was ordered to keep his rifle load for Brant, but he only saw him once. At the retreat, Captain John Wood and my grandfather started to ford the river. The bullets flew about their heads like hail. When about halfway over, 2 big Indians took in after them. My grandfather was holding his rifle and powder horn over his head to keep it from getting wet. The water was sometimes up to their shoulders. When they got on shore, my grandfather wanted the captain to follow him, and he would kill both Indians that were following them. But the captain said, no, he would go his road and my grandfather could go his. So Captain Wood went down the river and my grandfather up, so he could see the Indians when they came out of the water. He lay down behind a log and saw one go after the captain and the other follow him, and when the one following him had got quite near, he let him have it. He gave one leap and fell dead. Almost at the same time, he heard the other Indian's rifle and was sure that was the last of the captain, as he was never seen afterwards. It had then got to be almost dark, and grandfather traveled a little further and laid down between 2 logs. He laid there all night, and in the morning started for home, and arrived safe in good time, and was the last man off the battlefield alive. Major John Pepino's escape was told by him to his grandson, who communicated it to George Washington Seward, brother of William Henry Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. Major Pepino, as the battle ended and wounded in the thigh, traveled but slowly and was 4 days in reaching his home, and when he knocked at the door, his wife, before opening the door, asked if he was the dead raised to life. For another man had seen the major fall from the rock, and so had reported his death. Other survivors recount having to hide from enemy pursuers after the battle, trying to get home, wounded, on foot. Some of their remains were found 2 miles from the battlefield. For the Warwick area men, from the battlefield to home was about 50 miles. One of the things that becomes clear when you study the pension applications of the survivors and widows is that within the force hastily assembled for this battle, most were not untrained, untried recruits. most had already experienced battle, even major battles. At least 4 of those who were still alive after this went into it having been wounded in earlier actions. John Brooke had been part of the invasion of Canada in 1775, was wounded at Flatbush during the Battle for New York, wounded again at the Battle of White Plains, and had escaped from Fort Clinton after dark when it was attacked. Of this battle, he says in his pension application, he sustained 3 wounds by musket ball, buckshot, and sword. Sword meaning at the end, hand-to-hand combat. One of which broke his right thumb, which always since has been useless to him. He served after this as a lieutenant from 1780 until the army was disbanded. Wounded 5 times and continued to serve without being able to use his right thumb to steady the stock to aim and fire a gun. Joel Bower was in Fort Montgomery when it was taken and escaped out a secret passage near the river. He'd been wounded at the Battle of Monmouth and lost some fingers there. Here, he says, I received a shot in my left leg about midway from foot to the knee. I laid under a log the following night. In the morning, from the great loss of blood, I was scarcely able to raise myself. But with the greatest exertions, I succeeded in crawling to the bank of the river, where I fell in company with 5 others of the wounded, where we fixed a kind of raft of old logs and floated down the river until we came to the settlements where we were taken care of. They could not walk the distance home, so they floated. Many of the veterans had a very difficult time long afterward. Bower continues, after various misfortunes in life, I commenced a trade in salt to Canada. A short time before the War of 1812, I moved to Niagara, where it was well known that I was an old American soldier, and not apprehending any trouble, and it being difficult for me to leave, being then an old man, I concluded by taking no part in the war I might remain unmolested, but in this I was mistaken. I was apprehended, and they forced me to run before them 1¼ miles to the guardhouse, threatening to blow out my brains. I was then locked up in a cold, filthy prison, where I suffered incredible hardships for more than 2 years. Bower had been about age 16 at the Battle of Minisink. As an old man in 1845, living then in Canada, he was trying to get some kind of compensation for his service and his wounds. Prisoners. At this battle, we know of only 1 prisoner. The wounded who couldn't escape were executed. Captain John Wood of Tustin's regiment was taken to Canada for several years, instead of being killed, due to Brant apparently mistaking a hand movement as a secret Masonic sign. Wood summarized this experience in 1790 in a position to try to get reimbursement for the financial costs of his imprisonment. Not a handout, a reimbursement for costs incurred while in the service of the nation. He wrote to Congress saying, "Your petitioner had the misfortune to be captured by them. The Indians cruelly put to death all his fellow prisoners, and conveyed him alone to Niagara, and from thence to Canada, where he was kept in close confinement during 3 out of the 4 years. He suffered every hardship resulting from the inveterate malice of enemies. While in Canada, he obtained credit and borrowed £500, with which he supplied the wants of himself and his brother officers, who he found there in captivity, The United States not having made any provision for their support, and they being destitute of almost every necessary of life. After returning home, he endeavored to obtain payment of the money he had advanced to the other officers, but they were unable to repay him, so he asked Congress for the money he'd borrowed to buy food and clothing. A letter to him written 3 years after his petition by his representative in Congress indicates an interest in the claim, but explains that it is procedurally hung up. In 1808, the petition was finally brought to the Congressional Committee of Claims, but the committee's report states that the statute of limitations on the claim had by then run out. It appears he never got his money. The families. Our look at survivors should include others whose lives were impacted by this tragedy. What of the widows? The wives and families of the fallen tell their own stories. Many of the widows, of course, had to remarry or face destitution. In 1784, Ann Tustin, widow of Colonel Benjamin Tustin, appealed to the New York legislature. She says, "In the year 1774, Dr. Benjamin Tustin purchased a valuable farm, for which he ran in debt £565. He being at that time in the practice of physic, with the advantages of a good farm, would soon have paid. The dispute between Britain and America taking place, and he being zealously engaged in the cause of his country, eventually the whole care and command of the regiment devolved on him. He was then obliged not only to quit the practice of his profession, but in great measure neglect his farm, till in July 1779 he unfortunately fell in battle, and has left me a distressed widow with 5 small children. It is with the greatest difficulty that I support myself and family, without being able to pay any part of the debt." Anne was not asking for money, though. She was asking for someone to help her sell off part of the farm to pay the debt. I was unable to find a record of Anne ever receiving assistance from her country, or even her place of interment after her death about a year later, around 1785. This battle in the war impacted the families financially in addition to emotionally for the rest of their lives. Recovery. It is difficult for us to understand how the remains of the fallen were not recovered or interred at the site for so many years, in contrast to the terribly long and difficult efforts we witnessed at the Twin Towers to recover what little was left of those casualties. A few of the militia were detailed to scout the area and attempt retrieval or interment afterward, but were unsuccessful. The widows and others tried. There were 33 widows within the Goshen Presbyterian Church. Their pastor, Nathan Kerr, wrote George Clinton that 2 days after the battle, he led a party of 240 from Minisink to within several miles of the battleground in an attempt at recovery. Due to the danger and bad weather, they had to turn back. The widows of the congregation also report hiring a man to take them to the battleground. They paid a man to conduct them to the fatal wood of slaughter, promising to perform the duty. They hired a man, but even though had been on horseback, were forced to return. The man went on, but he violated his promise and never returned. One wonders if he did continue on and surveyed the carnage, whether he reneged on his promise out of greed or fear, met with a mishap, or could not bear to tell what he had found. This is not the only example in American history where the dead lay unburied. There are stereo views of skeletal remains on Civil War battlefields. The continually dangerous situation of this area, its remoteness and rugged terrain, combined with the horror of what they must have known was occurring to the remains due to the hot summer weather and depredations of animals, all must have added enormously to the grief experienced, and somehow resulted in what we can only think of was a kind of communal psychological paralysis. Today we would call it psychic numbing or survivor guilt. The entire community in the region was traumatized. It was their 9/11. And we can all understand, having lived through COVID, how the inability to have a traditional interment with family and friends present changes the experience of grief. No following attempts at retrieval are known until they begin to address closure in 1821. Finally, after many of the revolutionary generation had passed on, 42 years later, in November of 1821, a community member called for action in the Goshen newspaper. He noted that the Tammany Society had gathered the remains of the American prisoners who'd perished on the prison ship Jersey. The British had removed the remains of Major Andre to England. The writer was anonymous and called himself Vindex Mortuorum, Defender of the Dead. He proposed a committee to locate the bones and respectfully inter them. Haythorne was a member of that committee. Men were sent out to gather what remains were still evident, some of which, at some point, had been displayed on bushes at the battle site. That may actually have helped them locate some of the fallen. Finally, on July 22nd, 1822, 101 years ago today, a solemn procession was held in Goshen. It was nearly half a mile in length. Upon the platform at the lawn of the Reformed Church that day was John Haythorne, now 73 years old. With him were Major John Pepino and Thomas Waters, fellow survivors of the battle. Because of Haythorne's age and weak condition, his voice was not strong enough to carry very far, so another had to read the short speech he prepared. Haythorne and Waters then descended to the vault, and themselves laid the cornerstone. The community, after 43 years, at last had a ceremony. The fact that it was greatly needed by the entire region is attested to by the fact that an estimated 2,000 carriages came to Goshen for it. And it was guessed that the total attendance was 12,000. 12,000, many of whom, in one way or another, were also survivors. Why retell tragedy? After examining the stories, we're amazed at their survival of such trauma and difficulty. How did they do it? We cannot know their internal struggle, only a little of what they did with their lives afterward. Somehow, they continued on. Consider John Haythorne, upon whose shoulders as commander the burden of responsibility ultimately rested. Following this tragedy, and himself having been wounded, he served his wife Elizabeth and their 11 children as husband and father, making sure the family farm and businesses provided for them. Served in dozens of local elected and appointed civil government positions. Served continuously in the New York militia, rising to Major General of the Middle District of New York. Served repeatedly in the New York Legislature and Senate. Served in the First and Fourth United States Congresses. Served his community and his country, and at the end of his life, a story tells us that he did not even have a good enough suit of clothing to attend the celebration of Lafayette's return visit in 1824. We have stories about his sitting in local households remembering, regretting, mourning, wishing he had not listened to the impetuous captains of this battle and followed the enemy into the woods. And yet, General John was recalled by his grandson not as a taciturn, strict, gloomy, poor old lame veteran, but as having very bright, keen gray eyes, an easy, amiable disposition. He was genial, impulsive, and very energetic. Haythorne, through his faith and dedication to duty, kept going. What we can learn from the lives of the survivors of Minisink is that they did what we, by remembering them and the fallen, are also called to do. The survivors moved forward as best they could, one foot in front of the other, toward their goals, with gratitude for the gift of each day and the challenges it brought to their lives. Thank you for your kind attention.